Good evening, everyone. Welcome to week 3 of administrative law. We're powering through the term already. This week, we're looking at access to information, really important topic from the perspective of the administrative law process as a whole. Really useful sort of intelligence gathering step in the administrative review process, but also from quite a pragmatic perspective, really relevant to your midterm assessment. So hopefully there's a lot that you'll be able to get out of today's session. A little bit of housekeeping. If you haven't seen it already, the group allocations and the time slots for the advocacy session are now up. The links are available on Moodle. So definitely do check that out if you haven't seen already. We're in, I suppose, an awkward little phase at the moment where census date is next Tuesday. If you're not aware, census date is the last date to unenroll from a unit without being charged or failing the unit. And so we do see sort of a spike of unenrollments sort of throughout this week. But I did want to press on and do the group allocations so that you've got as much time as possible to be working on this assessment and working with your partner. Unfortunately, that overlap does mean that throughout this week, we probably are going to see a little bit of disruption to some of the groups. It's, unfortunately just the way that it is. If you do find that, you're trying to make contact with your partner and you can't reach them, please do let me know. And I can check in the system if they are still in the unit, and if they are, I'll make contact, or if they've unenrolled. If that's the case, it's no trouble to pair you up with someone else, and I do that as quickly as possible. And I try to pair you with someone who's already going at a similar time, or I try to keep you, if you were a junior counsel, I try to pair you with someone who was a senior counsel. So even if you do make a start on this assessment, there's no wasted effort. You'll keep the work that you've done in that space. But yeah, even that aside, I do strongly encourage you to make contact with your group members as soon as possible if you haven't already. So as I said, freedom of information and reasons for decision, really important topics this week. A few, I suppose, pointers or things to keep in mind about this topic as you read through the study guides and watch the lecture materials. Reasons for decisions are very important, and you can sort of think about them as sort of gateways to the decision itself, in the sense that it's a little window into the mind of the decision maker. It's a chance for you to begin to understand how the decision maker arrived at their decision. And from an administrative justice perspective, that's important because, people want to know when their decisions affect them, people want to know how those decisions have been arrived at. But from the perspective of reviewing a decision, or where there's a problem with the decision, the reasons can often be a really great first indicator to you of what those problems are, and it will help you sort of formulate your strategy, will help guide your initial investigations into what's gone on. And so as we go deeper into this unit and start looking at grounds of review and other means by which we challenge an administrative decision, so often the starting point is the reasons for decision, because that will give you the clues that you need to identify where the problems lie. There might be in the statement of facts relied upon, there might be things that were missing. And that immediately should sort of trigger you in one direction. Or in the reasons itself, there'll be something that, doesn't seem right, seems incorrect in some way, and then that pushes you in another direction. So it's really important that you develop a skill in reading those reasons for decision really closely. And as we go through, you'll get more practice at that. But the goal is to get to a point where when you're reading those reasons for decisions, you're sort of using it as clues guiding you in the right direction. It shouldn't just sort of be the case that you read it and you go, oh, well, I've got no idea what's happened here. So that's the goal that we're working towards. Freedom of information is a really useful, I suppose, complement to the reasons. Obviously, FOI can be used independently of an administrative decision, right? People like the media use FOI to find out about government decision-making all the time. But in conjunction with an administrative decision that we might want to challenge, FOI is really useful because it's another way of sort of finding out more of the behind the scenes stuff that went into a decision. So you might use FOI to confirm your suspicions about something that's gone on, or to get a little bit more detail about a problem that you think has arisen based on your reading of the reasons for decision. And I want to just share the Act, the FOI Act with you for a minute. Because I want to just go over in a little bit more detail a really useful distinction. So, and I'll just hide this so that I can see you guys a bit better. So Section 11 sets out the right to access documents subject to this Act. So, you know, right to access unless there's something else in the Act that is going to cause you a problem. And broadly, those problems that might arise in the Act, those reasons why we couldn't access a particular document, will be broadly falls under this Part 4, exempt documents, completely exempt or conditionally exempt documents. So that's Divisions 2 and Divisions 3, broadly speaking. Now, the reason that I want to really highlight the distinction between exemptions and conditional exemptions is, and you know, the lectures go into this in more detail, but I want you to be really clear in your mind that there is a difference between the two, and that the public interest factors that are in Section 11B, so these factors favouring access and these irrelevant factors, these apply to the Division 3 public interest conditional exemptions. So if you were doing the midterm assessment and you were senior counsel and you found yourself looking at some documents that were the subject of an FOI request, and you were looking at whether they might be exempt under Division 2, so say under Section 33, 34, something like that, they're not conditional, the exemption is blanket. And so what you're basically trying to do is argue that it doesn't fall within those categories. So if a document falls under, you know, national security or cabinet documents or something like that, then from the perspective of disclosure, that's going to be a problem to us. So you want to argue in some way that it doesn't apply. It's not a cabinet document or something like that. If you were looking at documents that seemed to fall more within the Division 3 categories, so, you know, Commonwealth state relations, internal working documents, these kinds of things, these are the conditional exemptions. These are the types of documents that the 11B factors will apply to. So the reason I really want to draw your attention to that is because if you're senior counsel in the moot, you might find yourself in a situation where some of these exemptions might apply or might look like they apply, and you need to think really carefully about which type of exemption it is. Is it blanket or is it conditional? If it's blanket, that needs to inform your arguments or your strategy one way. If it's conditional, that needs to push you in a different direction. So just an important and useful distinction to be thinking about. There's not a lot more I can say without giving too much away, but I do really want to sort of stress that that's something to be thinking about. Any questions about what I've just said or about the access to information topic more broadly? No, awesome. All righty. Well, let's jump into some discussion questions. And our first question today is, what role does the FOI Act play in administrative law? But related to that, on Moodle, Carlo has posed a really interesting argument that I would like for us to unpack in a little bit more detail. So I'll just share my screen again to highlight Carlo's comment, because it's related to, or in my view, it's sort of it feeds off that question, springboards.
Really? I didn't think so.
You don't feel like it does?
Well, it's more political. I mean, I'm just saying that people, when things go wrong in the political system, they don't try to access the information to try and find out why it was done.
That's true. That's true. I suppose the reason why I feel like there's a connection is because this question one is talking about, what role does it play? And theoretically, one of the roles that the FOI Act plays is to provide a mechanism by which the community can become better informed and therefore more participate more effectively. And then, in your post, you've gone on to, express some cynicism towards that argument, which I think is perfectly valid, right? The degree to which people do choose to engage with politics more broadly, but especially choose to seek out information about government decision-making and government processes does often leave, I suppose, a lot to be desired. So I think it's perfectly reasonable to express some doubt about that as an objective of FOI. So I thought it might be, a useful sort of starting point for a broader discussion about the role of FOI, and even if it does in theory have all these benefits, are they realized in practice in the lives of everyday people? So I wanted to, I suppose, open the discussion up with some of those ideas.
Well, I guess, one thing I'd probably say is from the textbook, it's sort of highlighted that prior to those reforms coming in, or the idea of them, I think in the late 70s, government decision-making, you couldn't get sort of any information whatsoever, well, really at all, from decisions that would affect you.
Yeah, so thinking about, okay, what's the alternative? Sure, maybe no one really uses this, but at least the option's there.
Since it's, I guess in the context of the democratic process, it's a big improvement, but I guess in the context of administrative law, that's a different question.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's a really good perspective, sort of separating out how does the FOI process work in an administrative law context versus how does it work to inform the polity more broadly. Yeah, absolutely. Anyone else? Talitha, you've got your hand up.
I was just going to, even though I hate the phrase play devil's advocate, I was just going to push back a little bit on Carlo sort of saying, particularly kind of narrowing on young people. Not that I'm maybe necessarily considered young anymore, but I do think we all sort of tend to live in a vacuum. Like, I am quite politically engaged, and maybe it's because I surround myself with like-minded people. I actually think that young people these days are incredibly engaged in issues. I think when you look at issues like climate change, when you look at things like the Me Too movement, when you look at things like that, those sorts of things wouldn't be heading in the direction that they're heading in if young people weren't politically engaged. So I do think sometimes it can come down to who you potentially, like you're sort of like the sum of who you're looking at. But I definitely don't think that it's across the board that people aren't politically engaged. If anything, I actually think it's kind of the opposite.
Okay. Yeah, that's an interesting perspective. And I think, this is slightly off, well, very much off topic. One of the things that I really like about CQU as a university and you guys as a cohort is that you are a lot more diverse than sort of a traditional on-campus model university, right? You're not even all on the same location. The age breakdown is much more varied, all that sort of stuff. And so one of the great things about these kinds of discussions is that, sure, as individuals, we do tend to live in a bit of a bubble. We sort of, get these echo chambers. My Twitter is, very, very narrowly cast, just as an example. But by having these discussions as a group, we do get, I suppose, a much broader range of perspectives, which is really cool and really useful. And with that in mind, did anyone else want to weigh in?
I guess the only other thing I wanted to say was there was something in the textbook. I think one of the article type things was from Tony Blair, and there was another one from some other guy sort of arguing how bad the right to information legislation is and why it's problematic, in the sense that often public servants will seem to just, rather than be open, they'll just hide their decision making and hide behind reasons and, hide records, do all sorts of things that I guess they argue causes more problems than it solves.
Yeah, certainly. And this is an ongoing challenge that all Western governments face, I suppose. But it's this challenge between, if in theory, if public servants know that their decisions are open or potentially open to the public, they will work harder and they'll try better and they'll do a better job. Or, as you say, they freeze up. They're worried about providing advice that might be taken out of context and might be taken the wrong way. So they word things in really specific ways that don't actually tell anyone anything, all that sort of stuff. And there's some really great examples in Australia as well that sort of highlight those challenges too. So yeah, certainly a vexed question that we all face, I suppose.
I'm not sure if anyone watches it, but on ABC, there's a show called Utopia, which is sort of a satirical Australian political show. And they do have an episode about an FOI request. And they spent like so much time not like trying to avoid like putting the information out there. And then it turns out that, it was a project that was on time, under budget. Like, it was probably the best possible project that they could have had to put the information out. But their very first response to that FOI request was just throwing like every single roadblock up against it.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
it's quite a funny show if you haven't seen it.
Yeah, I usually there's a 1 minute clip from that episode that I usually post with this topic, and I forgot to do it. I thought of it about 2 minutes before the tutorial, so I'll post that one up on Teams afterwards, because yeah, it's great. It's just like a reflex. Oh well, we won't be giving them that. Yeah, it's great. And you know, Utopia and Hollow Men before it really do tap into
Yes,
the-
Minister, the other one,
and yes, Minister in the UK
with
as
Jim
well.
Hacker.
Yeah, absolutely. They tap into you know, yes, it's comedy, but they tap into a truth that's unfortunately exists within the public service. Absolutely. Alrighty, we might park that discussion there, just because we've got two really useful and really important, I suppose, hypothetical questions to get through as well. But thank you all for that discussion. That's really useful. So our question, we might skip question 2 for now and circle back to it, because I'd like us to be able to spend plenty of time on the FOI question. So if we jump ahead to question 3, Eaglewood Australian Submarines lost its bid to build submarines for the Department of Defence under its Future Subs program. It accused the department of treachery in awarding the contract to a French tenderer. You can tell when this question was written. And complained to the press of possible illegal behaviour by defence officials in the bidding process. So the Go Australia Go movement, who are a group of patriotic Australians, subsequently asked the department for access to documents which showed how the French tenderer was chosen. The request was refused by the Defence Minister, citing the lack of any legal standing and legitimate reason of the movement in asking for the document. And the Defence Minister also said that it would cause embarrassment to the government to accede the request. So Go Australia Go have come to us for legal advice. What advice would you give it? So the way that we'll approach this question, I'll just get some initial brainstorms, you know, just your first reactions. They don't have to be, you know, particularly structured, but then we'll take all those ideas and form them into something that resembles the thought process that I'd like you to adopt when you are thinking about FOI problems, for example, in your midterm
So
assessments.
I thought that, you know, the document, yes, you know, it could be actually, you know, commercialised document, but that the minister could allow them to actually visit the department and have a look at the document at some stage.
Okay, so some sort of limited or access with conditions. Okay.
Yeah.
Yep.
I was more along the lines of looking at Section 31B, excluded under Section 31B, being inner workings and deliberations of the Department of Defence and Cabinet falling within the national security, defence and international relations pursuant to Section 33.
Yep. Good ideas. We'll definitely
So
revisit
the
those.
minister can reject the request on that basis.
Yeah. Reese, you've got your hand up as well.
Yeah, in addition to what Bill's just said, so ministers can't refuse on the grounds of embarrassment. However, I would be looking more at the defence and industrial relations concerns. So he can flatly deny it based on it being a defence related document of international concern, was my thought.
Yep. I'll just get you very briefly, and it's, you know, formality. I'll get you to circle back to the embarrassment one. Do you have a section number that we can refer to for the fact that embarrassment's not a reason to refuse a request? Or anyone else, feel free to jump in as well.
Section 11B4, but I'm just going off your lecture notes quickly. I haven't gone back and had a look at the Act itself.
Yep. No, that's right. And then Angela in the chat as well.
Or Alpha.
Thank you very much. Excellent.
11B4.
Yes, 11B4. Any other thoughts? Anything else leaping out as interesting or
Well,
useful?
the fact that he said that they had a lack of legal standing and no legitimate reason. So Section 11(1) of the Act says that all members of the public enjoy an equal right to access. And then part 2 of that section says that a minister has no discretion to deny access upon a request. Like you don't have to have what's considered to be a reason to access it.
Yep. Fantastic. So looking at the issue of standing, and in particular, the FOI Act gives everyone an interest in government documents that can sustain a request, and then also the reasons for that they might have for wanting those documents are not of any relevance to the government as well. Excellent. Anything else that anyone wanted to?
Well,
weigh
I
in?
guess is it important from the start to sort of outline who the party is that's actually asking for the information? Because in one sense, the standing commentary would be relevant if it was Eaglewood Australian Submarines sort of seeking a statement of reasons under the ADJR Act. I believe you need to basically be able to take something to court in order to get reasons. So I kind of wanted to discuss, well, in the answer, first, who we're actually talking about. It's the Go Australia Go movement. So the ADJR Act doesn't apply there. So it's obviously it's actually a freedom of information request.
Yeah, and that's what's really interesting and really useful. You've drawn on a good point there. If this was if we were looking for reasons for the decision, you're absolutely right. You would need standing, so some kind of special interest or material interest in the decision. In which case, Eaglewood absolutely would have standing because they're the ones that lost out to the contract. But Go Australia Go probably wouldn't. They're probably a little bit too far removed. But FOI is a much broader process. The starting point is that all Australians, all citizens have an interest in government decisions and government documents, and so there's just sort of we tend not to use the ideas of standing because it is more broad, but if it helps you to think about it in terms of standing, Section 11(1) kind of gives everyone standing to access government documents. I'll just catch up in the chat as well, because I think there's some relevant ideas there too. Does the applicant have standing? They've got no interest or involvement in submarine building. On the facts suggest that Go Australia Go do not have any legal standing in the decision. Right. And so that's the interesting distinction, right? Go Australia Go as this kind of patriot movement wouldn't have enough of an interest to request reasons for the decision. And if we were sort of moving down the administrative process to ask for a review or to challenge a decision, they wouldn't be sort of close enough to the decision for that process. But they would certainly still be have the FOI processes available to them by virtue of Section 11(1). Just in the chat, Section 33, exemption on national security and international relations. Yep. And Section 47J, substantial adverse effect on Australia's economy. That's an interesting one. Can you tell me a little bit more about that one, Kelly?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, good. Well, if the transaction did have an impact on the economy, then as a public interest reason there could be a conditional exemption on some information released about the purchase, about the the specifications and the call to tenders, all that sort of process.
Yeah, that's
Wow.
an interesting one. Let's circle back to it as part of the broader discussion, but it's yeah, that's a creative one. I like it. Awesome. Anything else?
So I guess as you go through this question, you're sort of undertaking an assessment of whether you think it's, an exempt document or a conditionally exempt document. But even with the exempt documents, it doesn't say they can't be released. It just says they don't have to, from what I gather. And that, so it's not like a minister can't do it even if they want to. So potentially, if there's sufficient public pressure for certain issues that are relevant to the community, even an exempt document can be released. Whether that's likely to ever happen, I suppose, is another matter.
Yeah, it's a fair point. And yeah, the reality is that as a general rule, the public sector, and especially defense, they're looking to not disclose if they don't have to. And so, yeah, I suppose theoretically they could choose not to exercise the exemption, but whether they would.
Oh, no, I don't think they ever would. I guess just for the purpose of being strictly correct, it's just unlikely. Doesn't mean there's no prohibition. It's just that, when there's any law that says the government doesn't have to do something, particularly with information, they definitely won't generally.
Yeah, absolutely. And so it seems like we've sort of got all the ideas that people have kind of out. Anything else?
Sorry.
Yeah.
I'd like to just ask you this. I'm not really sure actually, but let's go back to the embarrassment.
Yeah.
With that, does the minister have to explain himself why, his reasons why it will be embarrassment to the government, to be able to get that reason across, or to make that reason legitimate, or can he just say it's an embarrassment? Because
I'm pretty sure it's mentioned under the Act somewhere that it's just not viable.
Yeah, so broadly the way, and again, it's worth keeping in mind that section 11 B4, which talks about embarrassment, refers to these conditional exemptions where we're balancing whether disclosure of a document would be in the public interest or not. And the reason that this is there is because there was a time where the standard argument was, well, it's not in the public interest for us to disclose this document because it would cause embarrassment to the minister or whoever. That would lead to a loss of confidence in the government by the public, and therefore we're not going to disclose it because it's not in the public interest for the public to not have faith in their government. Basically, that's how the argument went. So that's why those 11B factors, basically that's why they exist, is to cut out that line of argument. So the government can't say this would be embarrassing, therefore it's not in the public interest to disclose. That's cut out now. That's not an option for the government. And so it sort of, it doesn't really matter why the minister thinks that it would be embarrassing or not, because that provision excludes that as something that's irrelevant when weighing up whether disclosure would be in the public interest or not. Does that answer your question?
yes, thank you.
Awesome. Alrighty, so let's sort of consolidate some of these ideas and think about, how would you go about resolving this problem in an answer?
Can I ask one more question, please, Jacob?
Yeah, of course, of course.
So we talked about standing and the standing to get reasons and go down that review process that requires the special interest, but then you said they could have standing to go down the FOI. But what would that standing enable them to get if they did go down the FOI?
Well, and so here's why we try and avoid saying standing in relation to FOI, because it's sort of standing, but it's not really standing. The base position is that it might help to think about it from I suppose a slightly more principled perspective. The government works for you. The government governs in your interests as citizens. And so, I'm a citizen too, it governs in our interests. So everything that the government produces is sort of for us notionally, and should be, therefore it's kind of all of our property, and we should be able to have a look at it whenever we want. It's been produced for us. It's being produced by people who govern in our name. We should be able to view all that material to make sure that the government is doing a good job and running the country well. That's the principal idea, I guess. And so that creates a starting point whereby all government documents are available to all people in Australia. And then because that's just not feasible and way too broad, the FOI legislation aims to sort of pare that down to a reasonable level and to give some guidance and to make it workable, so that things like national security documents that probably really shouldn't be out in the public domain don't get captured, but things that it's very reasonable for the public to have access to, we can ensure that the public can access that and can view that if they want to. So in this particular scenario, we're talking about and we're thinking about documents related to this tender process. And we'll talk about some of the details in a moment, but the kinds of documents that you would, if you were Go Australia Go, what you'd be looking for, maybe you'd be looking for some kind of detail around maybe selection criteria or some sort of standards by which the tenders were evaluated. You would ask for, you might not get, but you'd ask for details of the different bids, and especially, the bid from the French tenderer, because you'd be looking to compare that to the Eaglewood one and sort of look at, was the French offering actually a better deal by whatever standards the government has set up.
Okay, so you'd be trying to get as much as you can without crossing the line into what's not permitted or to what's exempt.
Yes, basically. And you might ask for communications between the minister and various people within the department, various people outside the department, and then you get what you can get, and that may be a lot, that may not be very much, but that's the nuance that we're talking about here. But broadly, those would be the documents that you'd have in mind and that you'd be looking to try and get. And as we've been discussing, those are all documents that any person in Australia could have access to under Section 11.1. It wouldn't be restricted to people who were directly affected by that decision.
Sorry, Jacob, you just froze there. Could you just backtrack on what you just said, please?
Yeah. So those are those documents that you'd be looking for. That's something that would be accessible by anyone. exemptions that may apply notwithstanding. We'll talk about that, but that's something that would apply that anyone could ask for. It's not just limited to Eaglewood or someone who was directly affected by the decision. We'd all have an interest in those kinds of things. We could all ask for that under the FOI Act. And so I suppose with that in mind, structuring an answer to this question, the starting point that I would suggest to you would be that the Department of Defence itself has made 3 claims for why they shouldn't disclose. That Go Australia Go has got no standing, that they've got no legitimate reason for the documents, and that it would cause embarrassment to the government. And I think that we've fairly comprehensively discussed and rebutted those claims that they've made. Standing, clearly not a problem. No legitimate reason, as Talitha said, Section 11.2, the reason for asking for a document doesn't matter. That doesn't affect a person's right to access. And then embarrassment, again, that's listed in Section 11B4 as an irrelevant factor in determining whether something would be in the public interest or not. So the claims that the government or that the minister has made to not disclose just do not stand up. So you could deal with those pretty clearly and pretty comprehensively. The next thing that we'd want to think about then is, okay, well, are there any other problems that might arise? Are there any other reasons why these documents might not be made available? And we've talked about some of those already. Section 33, the national security, international relations, that's going to be the big one. And then Section 47J, potentially as well, coming into play. Let's start with, sorry, I'll just catch up on the chat. So Renee's highlighted that government tenders, the process to withhold while a tender process is still live. That's fair enough, but it's generally within the public interest to disclose once complete. That's a useful starting point as well. Thanks for adding that one, Renee. And then Neil's pointed to Section 7.2a, the agency is exempt in relation to a document that originated with or has been received from Department of Defence in relation to collection, reporting or analysis of operational intelligence, special access programs, or a document that contains a summary of or an extract of information from a defence intelligence document. That's an interesting one as well. And it's a good example of, I suppose, a group of documents that, and this is why it's really useful to be quite careful with these sort of broad national security style documents, is that it's easy to apply the national security exemption quite broadly. And, certainly the government tries to do that. And a lot of times that's very justified. But what's interesting about Section 7 is that, and Section 33 to an extent, is that on the surface, it seems like this would be pretty clear cut. Look, it's this submarine contract program. Submarines are part of defense. These are defense documents. They can't be given out. If, that's a reasonable argument, and I can understand why you'd make it. What I would like you guys to think about and to get in the habit of approaching these questions is to think a little bit outside the box, critically, a little bit creatively, about, are there alternate ways of approaching these issues that bypass some of those problems. And here, the approach might be to think, okay, is this actually a defense document, or is this just details of any standard government tendering process? Do we need the details of the submarine that the French were proposing to build and might be highly classified because we don't want other nations to know what our submarines are or what they can do or how they're built? That might be tricky. But can we say that the procurement process, the criteria by which the government decided to go with one company versus another company, that's just contractual, that's just documents relating to that probably don't necessarily need to disclose anything that threatens our national security. This is just a question of how is the government choosing to spend public money? And there's a very strong public interest in disclosing that kind of information. If there were some sensitive bits, those can be redacted and the rest can be given to Go Australia Go. And thinking about these documents in a way that is a little bit more creative potentially gets you around these exemptions that on first read would seem pretty concrete and would seem very much like they would stop disclosure. And so this is just an example of, I suppose, a mindset that I would like you to bring to these administrative law problems is just because there's a barrier that seems to be presented, does that have to be the end of the road, or is there a workaround? Is there some creative way of approaching this problem that you can think of? And what's, I suppose, hopefully encouraging for you for your advocacy exercise is that it's a live presentation. I adopt the role of the tribunal member. You're presenting your arguments to me, and via interruptions from the bench, that can be a fairly interactive process. And what that means is that you do have a little bit of flexibility to be a bit creative. If you are way off track, I'll let you know so that you don't waste too much of your time on something that's completely irrelevant. But there is scope to be a little bit more creative, to push an argument that you're maybe not quite sure about, and via the interactive nature of the advocacy exercise, there's scope for that to, you might do really well with that. It might be that it's a little bit off, but I'll ask you some questions about it, and that helps you refine the argument as well. So you don't get penalized for thinking creatively in trying to approach the solution to a problem. Obviously, you need to, be, you don't go too far off track. You need to be still targeted and answering the question. But, I'm more than happy to see creative attempts at addressing these issues. On that note, I will circle back to the Section 47J argument, which I think is a good example of this kind of thinking creatively. I think it would have some difficulty applying because the conditional exemption applies where it could have a substantial adverse effect on the economy by influencing a decision or action of a person or entity. I think if the government was trying to use 47J to prevent disclosure, it would have some difficulty highlighting, you know, who the decisional entity who's going to be affected is, and what decision they might be making that would that might affect that. The sort of the 47J that tends to focus more on not insider trading, but if you think sort of those sorts of sort of market level decisions that might be affected by disclosure of government documents. That's more where that's going. So I don't think that would really apply, but
Jacob,
I like that you were thinking about it. Yes, go ahead.
Could you use the example of how the, I mean, look at how the actual submarine debacle with France did play out. That, you know, from a public interest point of view, there would have been times throughout that series of communications that that would have been very sensitive and could have had a very big impact on our economy. In fact, I think it did, didn't it?
I suppose that the difficulty is what would disclosure of particular documents relating to the transaction process or the tendering process. I suppose, yeah, maybe, I guess. So are you sort of maybe arguing that if documents relating to the tender process were brought to light and it highlighted that, okay, yeah, this was a bit dodgy, this French contractor probably shouldn't have got it, that might cause some market upset as people, you know.
Yeah, it could affect
flood
trade agreements, all that sort of thing, backwards and forward between nations.
Yeah, maybe. I can see it.
I'd need more time to put the argument together, but I would have a go at arguing that.
Yeah. And I suppose if there's two steps to it, right? One, would it actually apply? To me, it's debatable, but I'm open to being convinced. The second step, because 47J is a conditional exemption, the second step is then weighing, is it in the public interest to disclose this document or not? And so it might be that it's in the public interest to disclose anyway. Sure, there might be some market imbalance, but really what it is the market responding to an accurate picture of what has gone on, rather than responding to an incorrect picture of how the tender process went down because there's been problems and it's been shielded away behind closed doors as the government approached it. So there's two steps, and I think on the whole, it probably wouldn't prevent access in the long run, but I'd be open to the argument, I suppose.
Well, the other one is that it destroyed international relations with France.
Yes, well, yeah, there was some, I'd say some personal level dynamics that played there as well. And so that's sort of falling more within the Section 33 exemption as well, then it would cause damage to international relations.
And maybe on the economy, it has to have more of a direct impact rather than an indirect impact. I think that's what you're saying. If you're saying that it's normally insider trading and that kind of thing, like a direct impact on the economy.
Yeah. I can't think of an example off the top of my head where it's applied, but yeah, it's a tricky one. I think the Section 33 international relations one is a good shout.
And I wondered if corporations in particular, I just was alerted to the economy being one of the subjects that could the government could use to withhold information. And I wondered then about the sway and power of corporations, and if they could convince the government to withhold information because it's, you know, affects their bottom line, and their bottom line affects the economy. Basically, does it mean anything commercial?
Are you still on 47J or?
Yeah, I am. Yeah.
Yeah, it's more. I mean, the economy being broad means that it's, you know, potentially got far-reaching implications, but the way that it's worded in terms of influencing a decision or giving a person or a class of persons a benefit or a detriment narrows it a little bit, and does make it a bit trickier to argue that it would arise. And so for this scenario, I'll be open to the argument, but I don't think in the long run that it would be successful. I'd think that Section 33 would be really the main problem. Defense within Section 33, the defense is potentially problematic, but maybe we've got workarounds in terms of focusing more on the procurement angle rather than, you know, the actual security aspects. The international relations component, and in particular, you know, the relationship with France and this French contractor, that is, you know, potentially a hurdle that is going to be quite difficult to overcome, I'd say. Any other final questions on that one? I've seen on Teams some discussion of question 2. So I'll post on Teams a response to question 2. Not in detail, but just highlighting the key points that you will want to think about and want to pay attention to in relation to question 2. But other than that, we'll call it there because we've hit 7 o'clock. Thank you all very much for coming along. If you've got any questions about the midterm assessment or anything else, of course, you're more than welcome to get in touch. And otherwise, I'll see you all next week to talk about merits review. Big topic. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Bye.